This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to start looking at Oracle's data modeling tool. This is going to be something that we download from the Oracle site. This is going to download as a zip file. We have some capabilities for data modeling within our SQL developer. However, it's going to be more in line with reverse engineering an Oracle database into a relational model and not necessarily going to give us all of the capabilities to create our logical models, go through logical model to our engineered relational model that can be used to generate DDL. So we need to download this in order to do that. And we're going to start looking at how we can use this tool with setting up some domains in this first video. We have one of our use cases that we've covered in previous videos, and this is going to be on the student courses. This is going to be the relation that we use in our tool to model and create a logical model, and then the relational model, which is essentially going to be our entity relationship diagram. We've gone through the process. We have our rough entity diagram. We have 4 different relations. Each relation has its associated primary key. We have some foreign key relations. And this is a really good example because we have a couple different options within the Oracle data modeling tool to set up foreign key associations. One when a foreign key is going to be used as part of a primary key, and then one where it's not used as part of a primary key. And this example is going to give us an option to go through and look at how that is used in practice. You'll notice that I have also highlighted a new field that was added to the student relation, and that's going to be class level, and it's going to indicate whether somebody is a freshman, sophomore, etc. And the reason I added that is because we want to be able to set up a check constraint, and we want to do one that's in the domain administration and see how that works. And then we also want to set up something with a check constraint in the entity relation model and see how that works. Now, our domain administration is going to be something that we can use to standardize our field definitions when we're creating some type of a field. If we have a lot of ID keys that we're going to be setting up, we might want them to be all set up the same way as the same types. In this case, maybe because we're primarily going to be targeting SQL Server, we want it to be set up as an integer. If we were doing Oracle, we could set it up as a certain number with a length, and we want to make sure that everything is set up in the same manner. We would set up a domain. If we want to have all of our student name, course name, and teacher name all defined with the same varchar 50, we would set up a domain for that. And then when we're going through the process of defining our entity in the logical model, we would be able to select the domain and use that to consistently set up the fields with the same lengths or the same data types. It's going to give us capabilities to make sure that we are going to keep to some type of standards when we're defining the fields. Think about if we had a huge system where we had lots of different addresses, we're storing an address in an order table, maybe we have a supplier table that we're storing an address in. Maybe we have a customer table that we're storing an address in. We want to keep the definition for our city names, our street address, etc. the same length. We could set up a domain for that. Once we set up a domain in the tool, it's going to persist over every logical domain that we would possibly create. So we can use that in the tool that we set it up. It's going to persist. It'll be there until we remove it. And we could use it to create another logical model. If we had a subsystem that we were trying to define of a larger system, we could then still use the same domains as we go through and define our logical model. So without further ado, let's go ahead and switch over Oracle SQL Developer Data Modeler. When we start it up, we should see screens such as this. It's going to have a welcome page. It should show that we have a blank logical model and a relational model. If we're not seeing the logical and the relational, if we go to the designs, we can always close all designs and it's going to essentially reopen it. That's one of the ways that we can get that canvas back in case we would happen to go ahead and close these things. I can come in here, and when I close it all, and that's going to pretty much reopen them for me. First thing I want to do is I want to go through and I want to save my design. It's going to ask me the name of it, and we're just going to do student course. Now I have something that's showing here. I still have my logical model underneath it, and you'll notice down below we have the relational model. So starting out, we're going to be working in our logical model, which is going to show here. Then we're going to move it into the relational model. There's an option where we can engineer the logical model into the relational model, and then from there we can go ahead and generate the DDL. We're going to start, however, with setting up those base types that we can use when we're defining our entities, and this is going to be through our domain administration underneath the Tools menu. If I click on this, it's going to bring up a dialog, and in this dialog, I can go through and define my types. I can add a type, and this is going to be, maybe I want the name of this to be for all ID fields, and I can pick the data type, and in this case, I want the type to be an integer because I'm basically going to target SQL Server for the most part, but we can go ahead and also generate it in Oracle. It's going to essentially be part of the primary key, so I don't necessarily need any check constraints or check between ranges or value lists or any of those kinds of things that I have the capability. So I can go ahead and apply that. We can see that it's now available in the domains. I can go ahead and add a new one. And in this case, we're going to set up one for name because we have the student name, we have the course name, we have the teacher name, and we want them all to be consistent at varchar 50. Now, in my logical type, when I click on the down arrow, I can type like one character and it should get us down to essentially the range of values that I want to choose from. It's not very great from the list perspective as far as filtering the list. If I would go ahead and maybe get 2 values typed in, it may work, but it's not going to work very well to try to filter it farther than like 2 values. We're going to enter 50. We're not going to go ahead and do any check constraints because we have the capability to do a mandatory field in the logical model. So we're not going to bother with that for this. We can apply this, and then we're going to go ahead and add the class level. Now the class level is going to be something that we do want to have a range of values, like an F for freshman, an S for sophomore, and that's about essentially all we're going to do at this point. Keep it pretty simple. We're not going to go wild as far as setting up some of these things. But this is going to be a char type, and I want to set its size to be 1. With our domain constraints, we have a couple different ways that we can set up our domain constraint. We can use a value list, we can use ranges, and we can use a check constraint. With our ranges, this is going to be something where I have a beginning value and an ending value that I can add, but that's not the case here. I can also set something up with a value list, which is what applies here. In the next Farfetch example we're going to set up, this is going to be the check constraint that we use. But for this one, we're going to use that value range, that value list. And here we're just going to add F and add a description here for freshman. And I double clicked to get it into the description field. And this is going to be S. If I tab, it's going to take me there, but I have to still double click in order to get it to be enterable. Not the most user-friendly tool, but it does save us some time when we're trying to draw pictures. And this is going to be sophomore. And if I misspelled that, I apologize. I'm a terrible speller. That's not necessarily something a programmer has to be great at. And in this case, we're going to apply it and then go ahead and add our last one. And this is the one that's going to be Farfetch. We have ways around doing this, and we would normally not do this, but I want to show how we can add a check constraint. So this is going to be email address. We're going to set this up as varchar as well. So if I go down to the V's, and we're just going to set this up at 256, that should be sufficient to store any type of email address that we might come up with. And in this case, we're going to use the check constraint. When I get into my constraints list, it's essentially going to give me the databases that it can generate. So we can see that it can generate Oracle, we can generate SQL Server, and we can generate DB2. So that will be the DDL that we can generate from our model that we're generating here. And this is going to be something where I want to generate DDL for both Oracle and SQL Server when I'm going through the walkthrough. So I'm going to go ahead and use the generic constraint as opposed to pick one of the specific ones. If I was targeting a specific database, then I would pick something more in line. Now, it doesn't necessarily always have the latest versions for some of these. Like we see that we have SQL Server 2012. That should be sufficient. We don't need anything beyond 2012 for SQL Server. We have something more current for Oracle, but it's not the latest version either. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and double click in the generic constraint in the field next to it. That's going to bring up a dialog, and this is where we can enter whatever the constraint is. We're going to start with a %model %, and that's going to be the start of any type of constraint that we would write. And we can do something and put in where it's greater than 0 because maybe we don't have an ending range. And that would look something like this. And that would be a constraint that we could add to our field. We could also do something in this case where it is not null. And again, this would not be the preferred method to do that because we have a mandatory value that we can set when we're defining a field for our entity. But in this case, we want to illustrate that we can add a constraint, and then we'll take a look at what it generates from the DDL perspective. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and say OK, and then apply it and say OK again. Now we have everything entered, and we can go ahead and save everything. And now we have pretty much completed our domain administration for our little model. You can see that we've gone through and tried to identify kind of the groups and how we want to set up the field definitions for consistent types, consistent sizes, if we had check constraints, because maybe we have lots of email addresses and we had constraint that we really wanted to apply to everything that we defined. If we did it here, then it would just carry along. We wouldn't have to remember to go through it and do it on every definition for every email address that we define. At this point, we are going to close this dialog, and in the next video, we're going to go through the process of creating our logical model.